Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RockGaming.com video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to start things out with prices for the Ryzen 3000 series CPUs, also known, of course, as the Matisse family, which has emerged from a retailer operating in Singapore by the name of Bigram. Now, before we get into the prices, there are a couple of notes that we need. The first is that Bigram are not unknown in Singapore, and indeed they are pretty infamous in that country for supplying computer parts to people. So it's not like there's some, completely and utterly unknown retailer that no one's heard of or anything like that. So they instantly have some credibility there. The second thing is that they have actually leaked prices and specifications of processors in the past prior to their launch, namely the 9th generation CPUs from Intel, where they leaked both the prices and specs of the CPUs. Now, they weren't exactly 100%. I believe there were a couple of small discrepancies, but generally speaking, the CPUs did closely match the final retail configurations in both pricing and specs. With that said, I'm going to tell you right now to go into this, of course, with some grains of salt available. The SKU names and prices will be from Bigram, but I'm going to be using some of the specifications from Adored TV's links because the SKU names that Bigram are listing here are identical to that of Adored TV. So this leaves us to a couple of conclusions that we'll discuss after we've gone through their prices. Let's start things out with the Ryzen 3 processors. So what we have, of course, is a variety of Ryzen 3 CPUs, but perhaps the most interesting one to me is the Ryzen 3 3300. By the way, these prices are being listed as converted into US dollars. So what we have here is the Ryzen 3 3300. It's going to be a 6-core, 12-thread part, apparently, according to all the leaks we've had so far. 4 GHz on the turbo, with a 50-watt TDP. 6 cores, 12 threads is actually very impressive, particularly if these parts overclock fairly well. We'll get into that in just a second. We also have the Ryzen 3 3300G, 6 cores, 12 threads, a Navi GPU, of course, and it's 15 CUs inside of that, 3.8 GHz. Now we have the Ryzen 7 3700, which is a 12-core, 24-thread part, 4.6 GHz on the turbo frequency, and they are listing the price here as $336 US equivalent. Now, of course, we do know that a 12-core engineering sample CPU has been already spotted, and yes, the clock speeds were considerably lower than what we're seeing here, but once again, it's an engineering sample, so that doesn't mean anything really. Clock speeds for an engineering sample, they could just be testing any number of different things, including motherboard compatibility, or perhaps a BIOS, whether it's being detected correctly, or maybe the logic of the second core, or its interaction with the I/O controller, or a billion different things. The bottom line is we do know that a 12-core AM4 part does exist, and Lisa Su, of course, has already confirmed that we will see over 8 cores for the Ryzen 3000 series CPUs anyway. So the top dog though is the Ryzen 9 3850, 16 cores, 32 threads, 5.1 GHz, at least that's the reported clock speeds, and $561 US. Now, what gets really interesting here is that the prices in particular are very close to Adored TV, Jim's link, but with the asterisk that what we see here, of course, is that the prices, the US dollar conversion is then added with sales tax from Singapore. So what does that mean? Well, there are several theories that we can work with. The first is that Jim/Adored TV's specs were bang on the money, and so the retailer just leaked the prices a bit early. And once again, they have had a history of being oops with the 9th generation processors from Intel. The second theory is that they are just taking what Jim has said and using them as placeholders, making the appropriate adjustments for the prices just for the fact of getting the catalog out. This is the second retailer we've actually seen list prices and specs of the Ryzen 3000 series. The first was a Russian retailer by the name of eCatalog, and once again they listed specs and prices that were very close to that of what Adored TV himself had put out. So there are multiple different theories here. From what I've heard, AMD have not necessarily settled yet. Personally speaking, I believe that 16 cores, 32 threads will come to light from AMD for Matisse. Both OEMs as well as motherboard vendors are expecting this to be the figure that AMD are targeting for Matisse. And of course, once again, we've seen confirmation of a 12-core, 24-thread engineering sample. But as for things such as TDP, I'm less certain because, quite frankly, AMD themselves have said that TDP is going to be pretty much identical to that of the previous CPUs. However, when it comes to clock speed, I've heard from several different sources that we will see significantly higher clock speeds compared to the previous generation. Of course, significantly higher does not necessarily equal a specific number. Significantly higher could be like 300 or 400 megahertz, and some people would call that significant, others would call that insignificant. With that said though, I wouldn't be surprised if the specs that Jim leaked were the targeted specs of the processors. In other words, the targeted price point that AMD were hoping for, along with the target clock speeds that they were hoping to achieve. All we can do though is wait. As many of you are probably aware, the release date for these processors that we had reported is going to be in July, with an unveiling of these CPUs in June. So hopefully we won't have much longer to wait until we get concrete information here. A popular opinion I've seen online is that AMD would not choose to release a 6-core 12-thread processor, for example, for around the $100 mark, because it just would not be profitable for them. Well, there was actually a really interesting tweet that the retired engineer plonked online just very recently, and decided to just add that into this video because it might give you some food for thought. If you're unfamiliar, the retired engineer and put out some rather excellent block diagrams in the past of Matisse, Castle Peak, which of course is the next generation Threadripper, as well as Rome, which is going to be the next generation Epic part. And he is also a former motherboard designer. So let's have a look at the silicon cost calculator spreadsheet that he's put together here. So looking at the silicon cost calculator, he's estimating two costs. The first is the 8-core Zen 2 chiplet, and also the Ryzen 3000's I/O die, which of course is built on a 14nm process. You can see the various numbers he's plonked in here, with the die size to be estimated at 77 for the Zen 2 chiplet, and the I/O die estimated to be 131. He's estimating yields to be 70-ish% for the Zen 2 chiplet and 85% for the I/O die, which does make sense given the I/O die is considerably easier to manufacture, and also 14nm is just easier inherently. He's estimating the calculator has therefore estimated the costs to be around $17 per silicon die, with the I/O controller costing around $13. So then, there's a very good chance by looking at these costs that AMD could actually release, let's say, a 6-core CPU for around $100. After all, it would essentially mean that, let's say, one of the processors on the 8-core die was damaged, and therefore they would just use binning and say, well, no, this is now going to be a 6-core CPU. And then would do the obvious bits and bobs to package the processor as a Ryzen 3 3300, for example. But if we were to factor in other costs, because, well, it's not like all they have to do is just, you know, cough up for the cost of the silicon. There's also things such as packaging, including even the box, the shipping, research and development costs, the cost of employees, and all of the other bits and pieces. It is certainly not inconceivable that these prices could be a thing. My bigger question is, would AMD choose to do this? Not in terms of could they do this, but would they choose to be so aggressive in pricing? Simply because, well, we don't know yet what AMD's going to be facing from Intel. It's very possible that Intel themselves could drastically cut the cost of their processor. And finally, we don't know the exact performance of these CPUs. We're hearing so much information about the purported clock speeds and IPC information. IPC is said to be around 13 to 15, maybe 16% on average. And don't forget, IPC is not a static figure. You could even have a couple of games, for example, which use Unreal Engine, and performance could slightly differ just based upon programming or what the actual game is doing. So there are so many different moving parts to all of this. But I do suspect that we can be looking at around 10% improvement over the previous generation, especially over the original Zen. To me, it's going to be a killer CPU architecture. And I suspect that if the prices are roughly accurate, I imagine an 8-core 16-thread processor is going to be insanely popular with gamers, because ultimately games right now do not require 16 cores, they just don't. But I imagine at the prices we're going to be seeing here, at the clock speeds we're going to be seeing here, an 8-core 16-thread processor is going to be incredibly popular if these prices are even remotely accurate. According to John Peddy Research, we will continue to have an oversupply of graphics cards for at least 2 more quarters. We all know that there have been several contributing factors to the issues that GPU manufacturers have had recently. The first is very simple: the decline of cryptocurrency mining, which has led to a twofold problem. The first is that they expected the cards to be flying off the shelves much faster than what they were. In fact, people were not just buying 5 graphics cards or 10 graphics cards. People were directly, in many cases, calling retailers and purchasing hundreds of GPUs at a time. And if you think I'm kidding, I was actually told this by multiple AIB partners who were, let's say, venting their frustrations to me in private. I can't say any more than that, but they were incredibly frustrated because obviously gamers and people who wanted to just buy a couple of GPUs, let's say even at the time you wanted to buy 2 1080 Ti's for SLI purposes, well, too bad, because you were getting people who were actually literally calling stores and wanting to buy 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 graphics cards at a time. So no matter how many cards an AIB directly shipped to the shop, those cards were basically just gone before they even got to the sales floor in some instances. It was pretty awful. So you had AIBs and NVIDIA and AMD producing as many GPUs as they could for that reason. And then when the bust actually happened, because electricity costs were no longer worth it in terms of how fast they were producing coins relative to how much those coins were worth, they decided the better strategy would just be to just sell the cards. So that's what's happened. So websites like Craigslist and eBay are just full right now. And cards such as the GTX 1660 Ti were not released at the time, and the RTX 2060 also took longer to market. And this is because NVIDIA had an oversupply of cards such as the GTX 1060 that it needed to get rid of. So all of these things together have just led to the perfect storm of having an oversupply in the chain, but also meaning that the sales for retail have been lower than expected. Intel have basically not been affected here because their sales currently are from iGPUs. So while they do technically have the largest GPU slice of the market, it is all through iGPUs. And we're going to have to wait, of course, until next year for Intel Xe to really find out what they're planning on the discrete side. But AMD and NVIDIA have both been hammered, AMD slightly less so. But in the fourth quarter of 2018, we have actually seen around 3.3% reduction in GPU sales total. AMD declining 6.8% and NVIDIA declining 7.6%, which is obviously pretty damn, well, it's a lot of GPUs. But I don't think it's necessarily anything to panic over. I believe by around July, when AMD, of course, released Navi, let's say you've currently got a GTX 1060 or an RX 480 or maybe even an older card such as an R9 290, and right now you're only willing to spend around $200 to $300 on a GPU. I would not blame you in the slightest if your decision was just like, well, I might as well wait and see what AMD do with Navi, because it's not like your 1060, just for sake of argument, is a bad card now. It's still more than enough. But if your Navi card, when it's, when you finally get it into your machine, is going to cost you, let's say, $250 and put out, let's say, RTX 2070 performance, which is the rumored amount, then yeah, the smart money would be to wait. On the other hand, if you've got the cash to burn and throw into, let's say, an RTX 2080 or a 2080 Ti, people are upgrading because they know that the rumors are, and all of the signs and evidence point to the fact that AMD's high end is currently going to be catered to only by the Radeon 7. But with all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. Normal stuff if you did. Like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.